Deploying an ARM template for Azure SQL Active Directory authentication is a straightforward process that enables secure and managed identity access to your Azure SQL databases. To begin, ensure you have an Azure subscription, Azure SQL Database, and an Azure Active Directory set up. First, create a new Azure Resource Manager template, which is a JSON file that defines the infrastructure and configuration for your Azure resources. Define the parameters for your template, including the Azure SQL Server name, database name, and Active Directory tenant ID. Next, specify the resources to be deployed, including the Azure SQL Server, database, and Active Directory administrator. Use the Azure SQL Server properties to enable Active Directory authentication and set the administrator properties to the desired Azure Active Directory user or group. Then, define the Azure Active Directory user or group that will be used as the administrator for your Azure SQL Server. You can use an existing Azure Active Directory user or group, or create a new one. After defining the resources and properties, deploy the ARM template to Azure using the Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell, or the Azure portal. The deployment process will create the specified resources and configure Active Directory authentication for your Azure SQL Server. Once the deployment is complete, verify that Active Directory authentication is enabled for your Azure SQL Server by checking the Azure portal or using the Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell. You can then use Azure Active Directory authentication to connect to your Azure SQL database using tools like SQL Server Management Studio or Azure Data Studio. Best practices for deploying ARM templates for Azure SQL Active Directory authentication include using secure and unique passwords for your Azure Active Directory administrators, regularly reviewing and updating your ARM templates to ensure they remain secure and up to date, and using Azure role-based access control to limit access to your Azure resources. By following these steps and best practices, you can successfully deploy an ARM template for Azure SQL Active Directory authentication and enable secure and managed identity access to your Azure SQL databases. This will help protect your data and meet compliance requirements for your organization.